Rev, let's not do what happens sometimes when Trump is disgusting and racist in his attacks against Fani Willis or Tish James or Tanya Chutkan. We say, well, he hates all women, but he especially hates a black woman who's trying to hold him accountable, right? That feels like letting him get away with something that is for him a trigger. Let's put all of that aside and let's not do that. Let's also put this in the frame of what he sought to do to President Barack Obama with birtherism. This is more than insulting a woman who threatens what he thought would be a landslide, is what his campaign managers told Tim Alberta about 3 weeks ago. This is someone that threatens his grand plan to return to the White House after being humiliated by President Joe Biden, defeating him roundly and soundly. This is probably a warm-up, and I just want to make sure we put it in the right context. This was offensive. This was ignorant. This was graceless. He was a guest there. He was invited by journalists to answer questions, and all he did was malign and smear the vice president of the United States, a woman who is a very, very, very capable opponent against him in this general election.
I think that we must be clear that everything that you said and Karine Jean-Pierre said at the White House and Yamiche said is exactly what he intended to do. Donald Trump accepted this invitation to use that platform to play to his MAGA crowd. And those bigots that will say tonight, he went in there and stood up to those black journalists, stood up and called the vice president someone that is not proud of who she is, played to those few black men that he's trying to get off that he can start this. And I went in there and stood up to them and told them he did what he intended to do. You're right, Nicole. We already know he has serious problems with blacks, period, particularly black women, and don't, God forbid, if you're a black woman to stand up to him. That's a given. What you have to ask yourself after seeing this performance for almost a half hour is, what did he do it for? He came to do what he did. He came to use them as a backboard to score with the MAGA crowd, to say, I'm one of y'all. I will go to their own conference and do everything but call them the N-word. And I will try and act like their candidate, their hero, this strong black woman they're rallying around. She didn't even say she was black until a little while ago. When did we not know she was black? When she was elected the first black district attorney of San Francisco? Or maybe when she was elected the first black attorney general of the state of California. Or maybe we missed it when we said she was the only black woman in the U.S. Senate, or the only black woman to run for vice president. Why play into this illusionary picture when we can deal with who the painter of the picture is? Donald Trump saw the NABJ as a useful platform for him to show that he will stand up to blacks and call us whatever he wants to call us and attack our people in their face, and they ain't gonna do anything about it. That's what he went to do, and that's what he did.
Claire.
Yeah, I don't disagree with Rev, although he's trying to get votes. And what I'm trying to figure out is, what votes did he think he was going to add to his MAGA base by doing what he did today? I can't imagine that he is so dumb that he thought he would add any black votes by talking about black jobs and saying what he said about the vice president. And maybe he is just trying to show the MAGA base that he would do this, but they know that already. They know he's one of, many of them agree with him about his less than view of people that don't look like them. So then the question is he trying to get us to talk about him? Is he so freaked out that he has not been dominating the airwaves for the last week that he was wanting to be so outrageous that we would sit here and talk about him today? So either he's really dumb, because what he did today, I don't think it gets him any more MAGA votes. He's got those votes.
Right.
Certainly doesn't get him any of the votes he doesn't have. Certainly doesn't get him any black votes. Or is he just that sick you know, is he just that sick? And so, dumb or sick.
Yeah,
you got to pick one of the two.
I mean, Yamiche, I wrote down a lot of what you said, but you said we're covering him objectively. I mean, objectively speaking, this was a very unsteady performance. I mean, if the Republican Party was functioning and functional, you might imagine a functioning party would wonder if the person at the top of the ticket should be at the top of the ticket, if this was a person that was displaying adequate fitness. I mean, as someone who covered him and then saw this, how do you sort of just grade it performatively, even against a Trump curve?
Well, I'll say this. I don't know that as a reporter I can grade former President Trump. I think Republicans graded him when they nominated him again to be their nominee and to run for president. There was a primary. They saw him. They knew what he said. They knew what his past was. And they saw him and said he was going to be the face of the party. And we've watched over the years as the Republican Party has been made into the party of Trump. So I think they're going to decide whether or not this was something that was acceptable. There is some reporting that his team had agreed to an hour, and after 34 minutes, they said that this needed to end. There was a point, though, that he said that we were starting 30 minutes late, that NABJ and him, and then that NABJ wasn't starting on time. So maybe that factored into their decision. But it tells me that possibly they thought this wasn't going well, so they pulled him off the stage. But if I could, Nicole, I also want to read to you a statement that we just got from the Harris campaign, if you would allow me to, because I think it also just underscores sort of how they're seeing this moment. Is that okay for me to read that?
Of course.
So they write, the hostility, this is Michael Tyler, who is the communications director for the Harris campaign. The hostility Donald Trump showed on stage today is the same hostility he has shown throughout his life, throughout his term in office, and throughout his campaign for president as he seeks to regain power and inflict his harmful Project 2025 agenda on the American people. Trump lobbed personal attacks and insults at Black journalists the same way he did throughout his presidency, while he failed Black families and left the entire country digging out of the ditch he left us in. Donald Trump has already proven he cannot unite America, so he attempts to divide us. The statement goes on to say, today's tirade is simply a taste of the chaos and division that has been a hallmark of Trump's MAGA rallies and this entire campaign. It's also exactly what the American people will see from across the debate stage as Vice President Harris offers a vision of opportunity and freedom for all Americans. All Donald Trump needs to do is stop playing games and actually show up to the debate on September 10th. So that tells you where the Harris campaign is. They're calling him out, saying this is insulting, but they're also saying, you know what? And this, I think, goes back to what Vice President Harris said yesterday when she had a campaign rally in Atlanta with some 10,000 people there. She said, if you have something to say it to my face. So this is the campaign following up on that, saying, if you want to say something about my race or my policies or how I dealt with the border, say it to my face and show up on September 10th and debate me, Nicole.
Rev, let me ask you to follow up. I mean, say it to my face was where we were going to lead before this rolling train wreck sort of captured everyone's attention. And I'm sensitive as a person who sits in this chair to the decisions we make. And I think Claire's onto something, that Trump's insatiable desire for attention has been satisfied by the fact that we're talking about him. I do want to, I'm just, you know, we're at the data point in the cycle, right? And in terms of adding voters, he did come out today as anti-woman, anti-Black women, especially anti-press. The statements included anti-law enforcement tirades and any family that doesn't look like J.D. Vance's, basically, which would, I guess, speaking about the data, also include his. I want to play you, Rev, some of what he said about January 6th.
So my question is on those.
What's going to happen to
my
the
question
people
is
that
on
tried
those
to
rioters who assaulted officers.
You have to
would you pardon
what's
those
going to
people?
happen? Oh, absolutely, I would.
You would pardon those?
If they're innocent, I would pardon them.
They've been convicted.
And by the way, the Supreme Court just they were convicted by a very tough system. They were.
But sir, we're talking about people that were seen beating officers with flagpoles, dragging them down the stairs. They're on video. Have you seen that video, sir?
Oh, really? Well,
you would pardon those. You would pardon those rioters?
They shot a young lady in the face who was protesting. They shot her in the face. You know, nobody died that day.
Vladimir Putin, I think, had the exact same sentence structure in an interview with NBC's own Keir Simmons when he describes January 6th. Possibly a coincidence, maybe not. Your thoughts on Yamiche's reporting and that exchange?
I think that we must remember when you hear Donald Trump, his political experience was that he rose to national political capital and became the nominee on birtherism, denying that Barack Obama was an American, and in fact saying he was born in Kenya and that he would produce a birth certificate. That's how he started his political career. So for us to think that he does not think he can use a similar thing to Kamala Harris, we're acting like this is a guy that was in the Senate 15 years. He doesn't play by the same political kind of knowledge and strategy that one would play for votes. It worked for him with birtherism. He feels it'll work with him in terms of trying to make Kamala Harris appear to be less than what she says she is. Secondly, I think we must remember he's a guy that he has no idea what policy is. When you bring up DEI, he didn't ask the interviewer, how do you define DEI, because he wanted her to define it. He does not know how to define DEI. So he had to turn it back on her and kind of duck having to answer diversity, equity, and inclusion, because he's against DEI because it plays to his crowd. If you ask him what DEI was, if you ask him what his immigration policy is, he doesn't know. It's all bombast and performance. And that's why I say he went there today to perform. He did not go there as any former president or potential president calculating how I get votes. He didn't calculate how birtherism would work. It worked for him. And he's trying to find his birtherism rhythm this time. And he experimented. It's like an artist going on stage looking for the right song. He was experimenting. Maybe this is how you go after Kamala. So I love what Claire's saying. I love Claire. But if you're looking for a logical political strategy, Donald Trump and political strategy don't go in the same room.